debaters for this evening. They are not Ph.D.s in the First Amendment. They are not experts in the topic. They are qualified, amazing debaters, and I know they're going to do a fantastic job. But please just keep in mind that this is much more of a safe, open space for us to practice constructive dialogue with a structured format. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Our topic for this evening, controversial speakers are good for public universities. So free speech at public universities and colleges is simultaneously the most obvious and the most paradoxical of constitutional principles. Because on one hand you have academic inquiry, where only an open and critical environment for speech will support the ultimate quest for truth. However, universities must take into consideration issues of civility, respect, ethics, and human dignity. There's a really interesting Gallup Knight Foundation survey that I want to read a couple statistics off of that was taken in March of 3,000 U.S. college students. 70% of students still favor an open learning environment that allows all types of speech over one that puts limits on offensive speech. But that number is down from 78% in 2016. 92% of students say liberals are free to share their views on campus, whereas 69% say conservatives are free to share their views. 62% say shouting down speakers is never acceptable, but 37% believe it is sometimes acceptable. So when a controversial speaker is invited to a public university by a student organization, when hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars are spent on security measures, when mass protests threaten violence on an otherwise safe campus, is the idea of academic inquiry substantiated or not? If the purpose of universities are to enhance society, then how do we determine whether or not a speaker contributes to that objective? Well, that sounds like a really interesting debate, so I'm excited to have it, and we're going to intro our debaters for the evening. Our first debater arguing for the motion is a budding entrepreneur in New York City's fashion and lifestyle scene as a men's wardrobe stylist. He also currently works for the fast-growing startup Gloden. He is an avid proponent of free speech, and he hopes to revitalize the once great Black Wall Streets of this nation. Please welcome Kyrie McLaurin Davis. Our second debater arguing for the motion is a freelance writer, debate coach, and content creator at the startup Threshold 360, where he creates virtual experiences of the world around us. Ladies and gentlemen, Jaquan Heath. Our first debater arguing against the motion is a frustrated student of philosophy. For a moment, he considered a career as a social studies teacher, but instead works as an operations manager and senior IT recruiter at an NYC staffing firm. On the side, he's a blogger and music critic. Please welcome Bob Schaefer. Our second and final debater for the evening, arguing against the motion, also participated in our debate last year on universal basic income. He's a public defender with the Bronx Defenders, and when he's not fighting in court, he works as a community organizer with the Democratic Socialists of America. His advocacy work centers around anti-racism, economic justice, and nonviolent direct action against the alt-right. If you saw a video back in April of Milo Yiannopoulos being forced out of an NYC bar to chants of Nazi scum get out, our next debater was right there in the crowd. He clearly has some strong opinions. Ladies and gentlemen, Sam Natali. So again, a diverse crowd of debaters, but all have been prepping and working hard in their own voluntary time, and we're excited to get this going. Just to give you a rundown of how this works, each debater is going to have a 5-minute opening speech. Then we're going to move into a 30-minute crossfire where I will open up with questions to them, and then we'll open up with questions from the audience, and then we'll close with a 3-minute closing speech per debater in the same order, and then we'll tally up the ballots after that and determine a winner. So coming up first to the stage, we have Kyrie.
The idea that sex or gender is malleable is not true. what mode of transportation to get back to your country if you don't have a flying carpet? Take a camel. 1 second, guys. Feminism is kind of silly. Thank you. Respectively, Ben Shapiro, Ann Couture, and Milo Yiannopoulos, all at public universities. Very controversial speakers to this day, but also controversy has another side to it. The American propaganda is designed to make us think that no matter how much hell we catch here, we're still better off in America than we would be anywhere else. So their solution to our problem is to be content and continue to catch hell from the American white man. Segregation wasn't abolished because presidents or judges or legislators had epiphanies about the injustices of the immoralities or racial segregations. It was disestablished because ordinary people became collectively aware of their own potential power as agents of social change. Welcome to Colorado State Penitentiary in regards to Colorado State University. Also respectively, Malcolm X, UC Berkeley in 1963, Angela Davis at UC Davis in 2006, and Abbie Hoffman, the leader of the hippie movement from 1968, addressing Colorado State University. Today we're in this sort of cultural upheaval, where there seems to be a cultural civil war going on. With this new generation of disruptors, a call to action for equality for all people, genders, with or without disabilities, the looming benefits and dire consequences of possible AI, and a somewhat slightly Twitter-happy, no-filter needed president, where do we go from here? I'd like to first start with saying that controversial speakers at public universities fulfill the exact mission of higher education and universities today. You might ask me, what is that mission? I would like to define public universities, first off, as any form of higher education that has met the requirements to get university status for higher degree granting institutions such as at the master's or Ph.D. level, and that also receive the majority of their funding from public means, such as taxes or anything else from the government. When one goes to university, one does not just go there to receive the skills needed to get a job. One goes there to learn and to educate oneself of the whole person, to reach a social maturation so that once you leave, you can add meaningful discourse, add meaningful abilities to society at large. You are there to be challenged. You are there to grow. You are there to learn. And my friends, you cannot learn unless you are exposed to controversial ideas, to things that will challenge you to the very core. To this day, I'm challenged. When I went to college, I definitely was a liberal. When I came out and I realized there was something beyond those forlorn walls, and I ran into the real world, I kind of changed. I saw and engaged other people from different walks of life than what I was used to. And we engaged in robust and sturdy debate, and I just so happened to change my mind. But that doesn't happen with everyone. What is good? That might be a slightly harder thing. For what is good depends on the time and the place of what we're talking about here. So what I would define good as anything that adds value to the course of life, to the course of learning, to the course of society. Anything that will push us forward as a people and as a whole. Controversy, as was proven in my earlier quotes, can change from decade to decade, from generation to generation. In the 1960s, it was unheard of that you would even try to give people these platforms to speak about rights for black people, about voting rights for women. But today, we have those rights. Most minorities do. Of course, there's some ways to go, but we must always continue in that fight. That does not mean that we just cancel out the other side. For if you cancel out the other side, how can you grow? How can you possibly learn? Thank you.
controversial speakers are not good for public universities. That is what I'm defending. Now, despite my wife, who is basically my coach, I guess, she disapproves, and a few others, I don't really think it's all that controversial, the position I'm taking, so let's give it a shot. I start with a basic question. What does a university do? Aside from providing March Madness and several, or hopefully many, New Year's Eve ball games, what does a university provide? For me, it provides two things. It provides research. Basically, it's the primary thing for providing various types of research and gaining new knowledge, new information. And it provides education. So basically, it is a institution giving us new types of research and education. From there, the question becomes, if those are the two things that it gives us, the two things it offers, how does it do that? How do we gain new knowledge? How do we gain education from a place where a lot of people go to it for the sports, the parties, various other things? That is probably not the solution. So I offer a quick list. You have, and these are nothing too controversial, but a quick list. I offer a faculty, a group of people, and students, professors, who have spent years, decades working on specific subject domains. I offer a canon of text, basically good text, bad text, but a canon of text which are focused on certain problems and challenges within domains. Again, nothing controversial here. Whoops. I offer a certain set of research methodologies. Each domain, and by domain I mean things like physics, things like literature, so forth. Each domain has a certain set of methodologies. Not one, but usually, typically several, which compete and challenge each other. So you have, so far we've listed what? Faculty, canons, research methodologies. Next one is publications, your research journals, your academic journals. So you have you continue, you do your research and then you publish somewhere. And last, and probably certainly not least, is your peer review. Basically, you have your back and forth between the professors, the students, and others involved in that process, challenging, confronting, offering alternative views, theories, alternative research in regard to that published work and all, that whole process, whether you're competing for a Ph.D., whether you're trying to get a paper published, all of it. So that is what is happening at a university. That's how you have your research, whether it be in physics, engineering, or in philosophy. And then you have education come from that, again, that ongoing discourse between those people regarding those subjects, all those things I listed. And ultimately, you come out of that with an education. Now, that is on the one side. On the other, you have the controversial speakers. We've listed a couple. You can, we can go back and forth on that. But what I would generally comment is they're coming from commercial media. Generally. And there are, I'm sure we can name exceptions, but generally commercial media. What is their relation to what I just described? They generally don't have a canon. They don't have specific methodologies, typically. Some do, some do not. But they don't have all that. They don't have peer review. I'm not sure, unless you consider CNN competing against Fox, but it's a commercial competition typically, not an academic. They're not competing in regard to what is the most accurate representation of something or however you want to describe it. So they are different in kind. And with that, you have the difference. And they don't really add value to the research, and they don't really add value to an education. They distract. Ultimately, I would argue they distract. So I am very much contrarian to this idea of controversial speakers contributing or challenging. I'd say they more distract faculty and staff and students from what it properly should go on at a university. So anyway, I offer a view of what should be going on in a university, what typically we consider And I leave you that for the moment. Well, that was good. Yeah.
Just a disclaimer before the time starts. If I use a you in my speech, I'm not directly talking about the opposition. I'm just talking about those who oppose the ideas that I'm going to present. Okay. So yes, a lot of these controversial speakers are coming from the outside of the university. However, we believe that the university is an incubator of public, private, and professional life where students are challenged to be taken out of the indoctrinations of their past lives through debate, study, and a laser focus on the various experiences and functions in public, private, and professional life so that they can better understand that public life as a whole. We don't think that opposition is targeting the root of the problem. The controversial speakers are not the root of the problem here. If you are saying that controversial speakers are this root of the problem, then you are basing this on the premise that certain types of free speech are the root of the problem. That is a very simple solution to a very complex problem, and in that respect, it is misguided. The root of the problem is a lack of understanding, which we will talk about more later on. First, some background information. Thoughts are the foundation of speech because we express our thoughts through speech. And this speech comes in different forms and different levels. Constitutionally protected speech, speech that may disturb but not harass, speech that you may dislike but is not defaming, speech that you may be afraid of but that does not incite violence, has inherent value. That is a direct refutation to the point that these controversial speakers do not have value. One could argue that they have the most value because they change the way that people think, and that is what controversy is. That's what controversy does. And speech has inherent value because of the thoughts that are conveyed in that speech, the messages, whether unnuanced messages probably, but messages nonetheless. The messages that are interpreted and the vibrancy of that message, sanitized or unsanitized, that connects with listeners. For example, controversial speech, as my partner has illustrated, is controversial because it makes assertions with which people widely disagree and agree. No matter how base the assertion, when an assertion is made, an argument is made. Arguments occur on different developed levels. A low level, level 1, argument lacks reasoning, research, evidence, significance, among other things, and sounds something like this. Oh, if you consider yourself an African American, then why don't you go back to Africa? That is offensive. However, if I solely focus on the offense, or if I try to silence that speech, then I lose out on why the person is making this speech in the first place. I miss the thoughts and the message behind that speech. I miss the fact that this person believes that I do not uphold American values, that this person is losing the America that they love because their communities are changing, and those fearful experiences are where hate comes from. I miss out on all of that analysis when instead of learning how to bring out that analysis and nuance at a university, I am learning how to silence others. So I have one holistic argument and a few sub-arguments which I can get into later on during the crossfire and also the last speech of the debate. My main argument: in a democracy with a robust, tried and true level of freedom of speech, with fairly strong government and legal institutions, there is inherent value of controversial speech, and when you try silencing that value, it backfires on you in so many ways that allowing controversial speech is a net good. Now let's talk about how undermining those goals, how undermining the goals that you hope to reach by silencing that speech is. Let's talk about how the goals that you're trying to reach are actually going to be undermined. Okay, so one, it's going to backfire. Because you are undermining the goals of the university. Because instead of learning that we ought to develop stronger empirical and anecdotal arguments and stronger advocacy skills and stronger self-expression and self-government skills, stronger truth-seeking, strong critical thinking, fact-checking, and nuance finding skills, we are learning that we should say shh to people when they say things we dislike. That is not the purpose of the university at all, let alone a public university. Private institutions with specific interests can do that, but not public spaces where we can debate public issues. Secondly, the second backfiring, the harm you do to the students is probably the most egregious undermining of this entire debate. You undermine the self-government of the very people you are trying to protect. And we are extremely offended by the idea that you would be stopping us from being able to develop the necessary argumentation skills to combat the speech of people who wish to harm us. Thank you.
Auschwitz has imposed upon all people of conscience a new and overriding moral imperative, that we must order our thoughts and our actions such that it is never possible again. Unfortunately, the forces that produced Auschwitz are once again on the rise, and here in the United States. We have the rise of a radical white nationalism that is backed by the president, which is threatening to undermine decades and centuries of liberation and progress and reinstate old hierarchies in which white men will rule over all. If we do not consider the lessons of history, we are doomed to repeat it. And the lesson of history from Germany, the most educated, the most liberal, the most free country in Europe in the earliest 20th century, is that these liberal civility norms are powerless to fight the rise of fascism. And indeed, they help it along. The reason why is because these white nationalists, Ben Shapiro, Milo Yiannopoulos, and the like, and most of all Richard Spencer, head of Identity Europa, they're not interested in truth. The only truth they feel bound to respect is that which makes them strong, that which forces their agenda through. And so this entire framing of this debate is what they want. They want to be included as if it's just one more controversial idea, that there should be the forced relocation of 180 million people of color from the United States, that women should be forced into sexual servitude, attitudes and ideas that people like Richard Spencer openly advocate. What they want to do is be included in the Overton window, the general ideas that we find acceptable. Because once they are in there, their ideas are virulent. They play upon the worst instincts in humanity, particularly the worst instincts in young and alienated and disaffected white men. They give them a narrative of strength, of dominance that they can tap into and say the reason for your problem is the feminists and people of color and gay folks. And let's not forget that these are also backed by massive corporate interests like Breitbart and the Koch brothers, right? That ultimately we are always operating at a disadvantage because they are going to say to them and to the ownership class of America what Hitler said prior to his election. If you backroll me, and you backroll my election, you'll never have to pay for another one. What their ultimate goal is a hierarchical system focused on a mass extinction of non-white people, and ultimately the end of the Enlightenment ideals, the Enlightenment project on which the university is based. Universities are not the root of the problem, but they are key to their strategy. They are the means by which they access young people. They are the means by which they get credibility and spread their doctrine of race science. So ultimately we have what Karl Popper called the paradox of tolerance, that if we want to protect tolerance, and I do, then we must never allow tolerance to be used as cover for someone whose only invocation of tolerance is to ultimately undermine and abolish it. And they are very clear on this. They do not support free speech except insofar as it allows them to recruit and spread their evil project. So the solution that I offer you is total opposition to them. That wherever you be, wherever you find them, whenever they rear their ugly head and spout at a university, that we take them down by any nonviolent means. And the reason why I advocate this and the reason why I practice this is because it works. Richard Spencer, in his Identity Europa white nationalist group, was on the rise for the majority of 2017 in the aftermath of the election. And their numbers started to plummet when they were no platformed at places like Berkeley. He says himself, constantly complaining that he can't hold public rallies anymore for fear of being disrupted. And if he can't hold public rallies, he can't recruit. That is where we need to hit them, at the university where they draw their strength. One day, your children will ask you what you were doing during the Trump years, when white nationalism reared its ugly head. Now, debate is no substitute for concerted political action, but by you voting against the motion today, it is a start of you taking a stand.
Really light material.
Super light.
All right. So, where to start? I want to ask a question to both sides because one of the most important parts of debate is definitions and scope. So I want to define what controversial means in the context of this. Is there a more nuanced boundary beyond outright lies and hate speech when controversial speakers are no longer deemed good for public universities? I'm going to open that up to both sides, but anybody like to start?
So the definition that we're working with as far as controversial speakers is basically any topic that is basically debatable but also draws very strong ire and passionate ire from public opinion. It can go very much against the grain, but this, like I pointed out before, can change over time. Only 50 some odd years ago, gay people getting married was unheard of. If you even advocated for 2 men or 2 women to get married, then that in itself was controversial. Now, if you talk against gay marriage, that today, in 2018, is controversial because the public opinion has changed. Whenever something changes over time, it's going to draw controversy. Any topic is debatable. Anything is up for debate, and that's really where we're coming from. So you always have to have that robust debate on both sides. Excuse me, on both sides to constantly challenge yourself, to constantly keep up with the zeitgeist of the times, because the zeitgeist can and will inevitably change. So you just have to go with the wisdom that comes out of your time and hopefully pass that on down to the next generation.
Do you guys have a definition of controversial?
Yeah. I've basically accepted the definition of controversial to be what's out in the media, what's in the culture today. And I'll broaden it a little, but basically today we're talking about the Breitbarts, the Milos, the people on the right. However, I would broaden it to people such as Noam Chomsky, and that's the easiest person to point to on the left. But there's others. I would basically say it's controversial is contingent upon where you're sitting, and it's obviously it's a cultural question. Yeah, I'm sorry to say that. I offered, and to add to that, I think we're looking at a very high level as to what, culturally, where, what is controversial. Within the university, there are controversies going on within the domains which I point to. And those controversies are perhaps what should be focused on when at the university. I think we're opposing what's happening in the popular culture, what's happening out in our streets. We're imposing that on the university instead of allowing them doing what they should be focused on, the things I pointed to. Instead of allowing them to focus on that or encouraging them to do that, we're imposing upon them with, if we say that these speakers should, and perhaps they should or could, they should be there, we're kind of forcing them on to the university, and, but anyway, that is, controversy is a broad topic, and I'd say we have to define, that's part of the relevant question here.
Can I ask you a question specifically, Sam? Do you mind explaining to the audience no platforming, what that means?
Yes, so no platforming is the tactic of refusing a open space to present in of somebody who is the target of that. Typically, it is used against the type of white nationalist or reactionary Nazi speakers that we see. It often involves anything from shouting down to occupying the space, and generally includes nonviolent means like that. Singing over someone is one of my favorites, and I think works just great.
So correct me if I'm wrong, the primary motivation of a no platform supporter is to prevent speakers who denigrate minority voices that are already stifled.
It would be partially denigration, but I think that this tactic becomes necessary only at the extremes of political speech. I don't think it's our burden to say that anyone controversial whatsoever should be prevented. I think that there is a narrow scope of white nationalism, which is the most violent tendency to ever exist in U.S. society, and that has existed since the inception of the United States, that has historically demonstrated that it is a category apart from other people who might just advocate free market economics, who I certainly disagree with, but I don't think present the same type of urgency that would make it a moral obligation and morally right to no platform.
So let's stick with that white nationalist platform. What we're doing right here is using rhetoric to defend our point of view. And what do you say to someone who is charged up and totally against white nationalism, but who wants the opportunity to face and interrogate these controversial speakers in person as part of the university's commitment to academic inquiry and critical thought?
So I would say that it ultimately tends to actually help the white nationalists when you do that. So Richard Spencer has never had a public speaking engagement in which he has come away looking the worst, because people generally don't know how to handle him. They're like, well, you don't really mean that. And he says, well, is it so unreasonable that I think that a white country should just have white people? And then they say yes, and he turns it around on them. Operators like Milo Yiannopoulos are incredibly skilled, and the reason why they can take advantage of this is because they have no truth to defend. They are not obligated by the way that you or I are to really hold something in our convictions. They lie so freely that it means that they will always wriggle out, always find a way to turn the debate around. And so generally I would say somebody who is interested in that, don't debate with them, take action against them, get politically involved. But this idea that they're going to change their mind, first of all, I don't think has been backed up historically. And this idea that you will persuade others, I think, is in this particular context a fantasy. There's something that you say, never wrestle with a pig, because you both get dirty, but the pig likes it. I think it's something like that.
So if you didn't learn anything today, it's that. You guys want to go?
Sure. So another person who advocated for this idea of no platforming on college campuses was Ronald Reagan, when he advocated for limiting the speech of minority students, specifically at UC Berkeley, right? And he used some of the same words that no platformers today are using, but I guess the political spectrum has switched. In addition to that, when you say that there's a rise in Europe of these white nationalists and these ideals, it leaves me thinking, well, why is that? Because in a place like Germany that have very strict codes on hate speech, why such an increase in people who have those views against minorities when Germany has taken action to limit those viewpoints. It seems to me that what actually happens is you draw just a lot of media attention, and when you draw more media attention, then it popularizes those ideas because more people are able to watch those protests, and more people are able to hear those hateful ideas that you are talking about.
And just to add on, my partner is exactly right. During the Reagan years, Reagan fully advocated for if you did not agree with certain views, his exact words were, they should not be given a podium, they should not be given a platform, which I find very disturbing because this reminds me of McCarthyism. And actually, Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas condemned he condemned the banning of communist organizations or communist speakers because actually when you put it out there and expose it as much as possible, weaker ideas will fail and the stronger ideas will rise to the top. This is what our society is built upon. This is the exact thing. This is the exact reason of why we have freedoms. So if you limit anyone else's freedom of speech or anyone else's freedoms, period, then your freedom could be taken away. Just because you don't like it, or because you see a very small minority of, yes, possibly white nationalists rising, but then you take away our ability to question or to figure out why. Just like my partner just asked, why is that when Germany, which they have no free speech at all. Literally, you can be an 8-year-old woman and put out some tweet about Muslim gangs raping kids in the neighborhood. Oh, you're going to go to jail because it's happened. It's happening now. You can put out a video on YouTube for teaching your dog how to make a Nazi salute. Oh, you're going to go to jail. You can stand outside of trial of a known group of minority people in a majoritively white country and film it and then read a public article that was already published in their paper and then be condemned to 13 months in prison, just like how Tommy Robinson was. And if you have people who do it at the university level, it just makes it all right for people to do it later on at the government level. And then on top of that, kids who think it's all right, when if we actually did do no platforming over here, they already do it in the UK. It's a thing over there. So thank God we don't do it over here because in the US, we have freedom of speech. In places like Canada, Germany, Britain, it is gone. The home of Speaker's Corner no longer has free speech. Are you kidding me? I can't imagine. UC Berkeley, the birthplace of freedom of speech in this country, wants to no platform anything that makes them uncomfortable. They need not be in a university if you do not want to be made uncomfortable.
So I'd like to introduce a category of speech that's known as fighting words, which is not constitutionally protected. And fighting words are those which by their very utterance inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of peace and pose a clear and present danger of sparking violence. So a lot of times administrators are using the words fighting words as a reason to support the no platforming idea. So when we talk about First Amendment and freedom of speech, there's a lot of different categories based on that. So I'd be curious to hear rebuttals on what you think about that policy, if there are speech codes that should be adhered to for university, or if that's more of a federal or state issue. And then we'll move into audience questions. Go ahead.
So I want to address one thing embedded in that question is this idea of speech codes and what they do and how they work. I think the example of contemporary Germany, which despite having an undercurrent of Nazis, has not bloomed into Nazi parties taking control of the government, is a very good example of how these restrictions on speech prevent that rise. Whereas in Austria, which does not have these, you've actually seen Nazis taking 30% of their largest ruling body, their Congress equivalent, right? And so in terms of these speech codes, I think I'm less interested in that First Amendment issue because I don't know that the state is always going to be the one to do this or should be the one to do this. Historically, we see that the state will often take the side of hierarchy, will often take the side of white supremacy. And so I think that the more relevant question is not for us to offboard our morality onto the state and say the state should decide this, but to decide as individuals and people of conscience what it is that we are obligated to do. And so I think that the question of framing it solely in terms of the legal question of what is and isn't a fighting words doctrine misses, I think, the thrust of the point, which is what danger does this speech pose? And just one last thing to respond to this idea that, well, you know, if we do no platforming, they're going to do no platforming. But the fact is that these people are all, it's not like they're waiting to be violent, right? It's not like they're waiting to clamp down on free speech. The only thing that limits them from doing that is not some kind of civility norm, but whether they have the power to do so. This is why they already murder people who oppose them. Heather Heyer would be 33 years old today. I say that she would have been, but at the Charlottesville rally, she was murdered and run over by a white nationalist. So this idea that there's going to be some kind of response, or we're going to get in big trouble with them if we erode this free speech zone, the fact is, I think the example of Ronald Reagan proves that the right wing is already interested in clamping down on speech, and the only thing that stops them is whether we take away their power, not whether there is some ideal of free speech that we expect to protect us in the absence of us having power.
Okay, and with that, we're going to move into audience questions. Before we get into that, please just remember that we all have opinions. This is a hot button issue. I ask that you please sort of keep your temperament at a neutral level as much as you can. Try and give as little anecdotes as possible. We'd love to just move into questions as soon as possible. So I saw your hand go up first.
Thank you. My question is for the side that is arguing against the motion. So you mentioned that you will be against speech, people advocating for sending African Americans to Africa. My question is very serious and very specific. What about brown people like me? Would you be okay with a topic debating whether Mexicans should go back to Mexico, whether Mexicans who have committed crimes should go back to Mexico, whether a specific topic, illegal immigrants who have committed crimes go back to Mexico, which is a topic debated in Congresses and cities? Is that okay? Where do you draw the line? What is your logic for those lines?
I think that's an excellent question. And I do think that actually the protection of immigrants, particularly from Mexico, but any kind of non-white immigrants, are where we're first seeing the results of a tolerance of fascism. I think the horrible abuses that ICE commits on a daily basis against migrant children is an indication of how hijacked our whole system has become, that we regard as normal shipping and detaining and isolating children from their parents whose only crime is being born somewhere else. I think that I would say that somebody who is debating that topic and saying that that it is moral and right to ethnically remove people on the basis solely of their nationality in the way that we've seen, I think that there is a very strong argument that that is not something that we should treat as a fair topic. I do think that there are still some views around naturalization and whatnot that are somewhat more nuanced, but I think that you're exactly right to be concerned about the effects that this toxic speech is already having, and I would say that I would support no platforming somebody like Milo, who at his rally got people to call ICE on their fellow students. I think that is something that we should not stand for.
Can you ask specific? I asked you 3 examples. Which of those 3 would be okay?
I think that could you go through them again, the three specifics?
Sending all Mexicans back,
Uh-huh.
sending only Mexicans that have committed crimes
Uh-huh.
from origin Mexicans, and sending illegal immigrants Mexicans who have committed crimes.
I think certainly I think that you could vote against the motion if you supported no platforming any of those, right? I think that certainly the first one would, right? That like sending all Mexicans back is an evil and toxic idea. I think that sending all Mexicans back for committed crimes, I find that objectionable, but I think that there is perhaps room for debate on that, or illegal immigrants, right? I also find that objectionable. I think the first one is the one that is most dangerous and most pushes the envelope. So I think it's a question of individual conscience.
The last
Which,
one is okay.
no, no. I think that they are all repulsive, but I do think it's a question of individual conscience. I think that in what we're defending here, all we have to defend is the idea that there are some of these topics that should be no platform, that there are some of these topics that should be excluded, and I certainly think that any three of those could meet that criteria.
Does anybody have a question for this side at the moment? Anybody? Yes?
I wonder if you think that there should be a difference in whether or not we tolerate controversial speakers who advocate for the expansion of civil rights versus those who advocate for the limitation of civil rights. Is there a difference there?
In my mind, no, there is no difference. Just because you have a speaker, usually when you have speakers who come on campus, one, they are invited by a group of students who want to hear their opinion, who want to hear where they stand, who want to really dissect where they come from, whether that group of students' personal core belief, their organization aligns with that speaker or not. They then, being a public university, will open that event up to the university itself and even sometimes to the public at large. So regardless of what the speaker actually advocates for, having them come there opens that forum of debate and provides you with that robust exchange of ideas, because it's the debate, it's within that debate. It's not necessarily the speech itself, it's not even the speaker itself, it's the ideas that the speaker is presenting. So when those ideas are presented, the best ideas will rise to the top, and forgive me, the bullshit ideas will fall. So someone who does want to contract civil rights, sure, they can say, I don't think women should vote. I don't think black people should be citizens of the United States. You can say that all you want. Trust me, I've gotten it a lot of times during my lifetime. But because I went to a mostly conservative yet black university, I was prepared for it. I mean, my university personally I went to Wilberforce University, the first black private university in the United States, founded by escaped slaves, not free slaves, 1856. So there was nothing that is stopping me. My personal university's motto is suo marte, by one's own will. Students these days need to get some will, not be so fragile and not be afraid of these idiotic ideas. Because once you show fear and you don't want to hear this, what are you in university for? How can you then go out and then contribute meaningfully to society when all you've been doing is staying in your little safe space? You have to get out of it.
I think that I completely agree with my partner here, and I think if you were to limit the speech of people who are, say, bigots and folks, that will allow their speech to appear true by default, right? Because you will make it seem as if those who disagree with those ideas don't have the academic rigor to actually challenge them, don't have truth behind them. And I do believe that truth weighs out. So if we were to put the arguments, like well-developed arguments, for why we should limit civil liberties versus why we should enhance them and broaden them, I think the arguments for broadening them will outweigh those for limiting them in all cases. However, we can't even figure that out if we don't have that debate, if we don't allow allow those controversial speakers to speak in that marketplace of ideas. And then that helps us actually develop the strength and the skin that we need to then counter those arguments with counter speech. And as far as fighting words, we are not for fighting words at all. So if somebody is being hateful and they're using fighting words, like we're completely against that. We're for speech that is protected under the First Amendment of the Constitution.
All right, we have time for about one or two more questions. So, right here in the front, screen share.
Yes. Oh, thank you.
We have a microphone coming your way.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I'm wondering about how no platforming can be, are you concerned about being extended? An ACLU representative at William and Mary College with no platform when she came to speak about students in the First Amendment, which is hardly a white nationalist thing. And my other question is, how familiar are you really with Ben Shapiro in light of and white nationalism? Since I've heard him, he's never spoken about sending blacks anywhere. He's an Orthodox Jew. And Milo, who is a gay Jew who is married to a black man, to accuse them of white nationalism. I just wonder what your sources are and how you're...
I appreciate the question. I'd like to advise that that is a little off topic in terms of, but I think the first part was a great point to bring up that we can address. Please.
Yeah, I think that certainly no platforming can be used for ill, and I wouldn't support it in those scenarios. I think that when we're endorsing taking a stand against white nationalism, the burden is to defend that, right? For in the same way that, like, for instance, one could think that police should stop crimes, but also think that certain ways that police stop crimes are really bad, or that there are certain things that shouldn't be crimes and shouldn't involve the police. In the same way, I think we can say that that no platforming is a tactic that is appropriate sometimes, while still recognizing that there are certain things that should not be no platform, and there are certain ways of doing no platforming that are wrong. All you have to accept to vote against the motion is this idea that there are some circumstances in which it is a moral necessity that we use this, and that it has worked in order to limit the rise of white
But let me
nationalism.
ask, so does that make students within universities, are they citizens of democracy, or are they under the guidance of the university itself? Because if you have safe spaces on campus, if I'm Milo, I can go on the street corner and preach whatever I want, and I'm protected by that. But under university guidelines, there are safe spaces, there are, whatever it is. So what is the difference? How are students protected under university guidelines if it's a public, federally enforced, and they provide the means for these students to invite these speakers? Where is their position?
I think that universities should support their students, which are engaged in blocking speakers that fundamentally threaten and undercut the purpose of the university, the Enlightenment ideals that we are supposed to combine knowledge and endeavor to undercut the bullshit hierarchies of, like, feudalism, right? That's where this all came out of. And so I think universities should design codes in solidarity with their students that oppose these types of white nationalists. But even if they don't, right, even if a university wants to take a hands-off approach, I still think that the students themselves should act in line with their conscience.
Yeah, I'd like to call. I think you're bringing on a larger cultural. So if you can embrace his position as to why we should not allow these folks onto the campus, that's one argument. We don't need to go. I offer a simpler solution to it. Just by the very nature of the university, we don't need. The university will decide what is a controversial speaker and what brings value. And most of these speakers that are, quote, controversial, that we're certainly talking about today, the universities have little interest in. They're not truth providers. I would say most of them are. I'd say it's a pretty obvious case. That's not the discussion here, but I'd say it's a pretty obvious case that they're not truth providers for the most part. And the university is interested in truth. It's research and education. There's something about truth in that formula. And if you follow that, and if you follow the things that I listed, you don't even need to get to his argument. I think it's a valid argument. I think it's a larger cultural issue, but we're discussing universities here. And universities have no need for this. It's a distraction. It takes away from a real focus. And yeah, I'm kind of jumping. I'll hold off on this.
All right. All right, we're gonna end Crossfire right there because we need to move into our final arguments. So, if you guys want more questions, you can ask these guys after the debate. Otherwise, we're gonna move straight into our 3-minute closing speeches, starting with Kyrie.
All right. It's funny that you guys bring up the mission of the university. I would concede. Indeed, I totally agree with you. The university's mission is here to seek truth. With that, I give you Ruth J. Simmons, the first black woman president of an Ivy League university, Brown University. While other types of communities divide covenants so as to avoid conflict, our covenant is rooted in quarrel, in opposition. We encourage ideas and opinions to collide in the free service of learning. We freely trespass the boundaries, criticize each other's views, test every sort of theory. No idea is beyond range or out of bounds. To be sure, there are rules, but such rules give us wide berth to the expression of ideas, and the freedom of expression is the very bedrock of scholarly investigation. How then can we possibly reach the bedrock of scholarly investigation if we do not allow even one idea to cross into the university robust debate of ideas in this marketplace of ideas? It cannot happen. If it does not happen at Brown, it cannot happen anywhere else. And to your point, which you say when most of these people are commercial media folks who come from YouTube or who come from Instagram, wherever. Ben Shapiro is published. He's been published since he was like 25. Also, Christina Hoff Summers has been easily shouted down at other law schools, future law students, which are using the opposition's exact premise of non-violent reaction to this to shout out bad ideas. Just last year, Josh Blackman went to Cooney Law School, who was also shouted down by future law students. It is on YouTube, as one of them even saying, "Fuck the law." You are a law student. These people need not ever be in school. And I don't know where they did not get the memo, but once you cross into that threshold, then you're opening yourself up to being offended. You cannot think without opening yourself up to be offended. Dr. Jordan Peterson even said so in one of his interviews, the famous lobster interview, because that lady, his interviewer, was making him uncomfortable. But why should her uncomfortability override his uncomfortability? Also to their point, if we have a moral right to protect these students from the bad things out there, what moral absolutism is this? Who's deciding what's morally right? The tribunal of the administrators at these universities? I think not. I think we should all be able to think for ourselves. And if you go to university, you should be able to think for yourself. If you cannot, learn quickly. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. My friends, I suggest, if you haven't already, start thinking. Start being. And if you have done so already, keep it up. You're doing good.
One speaker for the conclusion, right? One speaker for the conclusion?
Yeah. No, you both go.
Oh, we both. All right. I've already covered what I've said earlier. I'm just going to jump right to the second. I was anticipating that it would largely boil down to a discussion of free speech, marketplace of ideas, and let me go to another idea which I haven't heard here at all, and that is the concept of academic freedom. Academic freedom has not been touched at all, and that is disappointing. But it goes back to the points I was stressing before, that a university has a certain culture, it has a certain set of traditions, it has a certain history. And if we don't acknowledge any of those. We're just focusing on the larger cultural things, and we're almost negating what a university is and why we value it. So that's why I'm kind of here to defend the university, I suppose. Honestly, that's why I signed up for this, because that's what I value. I think that these cultural speakers are a distraction to the primary value of what a university brings to us. So academic freedom. I think we're in agreement that universities do pursue truth. That's a different question. What is that? But let's generally agree that we know what truth is. But if to pursue that, you do need certain rules, and he conceded that. And those rules go back to those things that I referenced before. Again, the faculty, the canon, the methodologies used, whether you're in physics or whether you're doing philosophy or you're doing literature, poetry, there are certain things that they accept as standards. And he did reference some folks being published, and most of them are published. I would say most of them are published in popular, you're going to find them in Barnes & Noble. You're not going to find them on course curriculums. You're not going to find them in peer-reviewed journals. And I will grant that there are some of them that are surviving in universities, and God bless them that, I am kind of happy that they're there. That I would welcome having that controversy they bring in a peer-reviewed journal, so they get their fair say, and if what he says is true, that there are weak arguments, there are weak ideas, they will end up at the bottom. More interesting, more challenging, more useful ideas will rise to the top, and that, again, I end with, that is the value of the university, and that is why we don't need these controversial speakers that are out in the larger media and culture. We're being distracted. So.
Okay, the idea of academic freedom and allowing students to choose who they want to come on campus and to protest who they want. So here's the problem with this, right? What if the majority of the campus of the university are progressives, right? And it's dominated by progressive ideals. Then do you just allow the progressive ideals to then subjugate the ideals of other people, like conservatism, something like that, right? And we see these examples in the incident at Middlebury College with Charles Murray, when he was invited by conservative students to speak, and they shouted, progressives didn't allow him to speak. They came into the assembly hall and they shouted him out, they shouted him down, and then when they were successful at doing that, but unsuccessful in being able to challenge those ideas. But then when he was leaving, some student targeted one of the university professors there, who was actually a progressive who did not agree with Charles Murray's ideas, targeted her, grabbed her neck, and twisted her neck, and she was hospitalized because of this, right? Does this sound like the kind of actions that we should be allowing at the university level relative to what you guys are saying that academic freedom should be upheld? I don't believe so. I think that we should be more tolerant of other people's ideas. And I think that there was a lot of misrepresentations on the ops side. For example, there was a misrepresentation that all these controversial speakers are just liars. We haven't gotten one example of a lie that one of these controversial speakers have given, and even if they were liars, don't you think that if we were able to challenge those lies, we can expose those lies for the lies that they are, and maybe we don't change the minds of people who are listening to that speech, but at least we implant those ideas into the minds of those people so that when they're going through their lives and experiencing things in the actual world, then they can see, oh, you know what? No, black people, all black people actually don't have low IQs. You know what? All gay people aren't like this. All Jewish people aren't like that, right? Like, implanting those ideas are extremely important because you have the counters to that indoctrination that you have grown up with throughout your life. Shushing people just does not work. And with the Charles Murray example, even though you silenced him from being able to speak, he still was able to sell a lot of copies of the book that he went to the university to talk about. Because as soon as that controversy went out there, as soon as the media attention, as soon as the media broadcasted the events at Middlebury College, his book sales actually went up. So we believe that not being violent and tyrannical in order to accomplish your goals in the name of justice is a net good, and developing strong argumentation skills at the university level is a net good as well. Thank you.
They made an admission in part of their case that I think goes to the heart of the disagreement here. They said there is no difference between those supporting civil rights and those who oppose them. This is the kind of nihilism, this is the kind of postmodern nonsense in which white nationalism thrives. The idea that it is just as good or just a fine thing to do. That this person says that we should have, universal health care, and this person wants to gash Jews, and tomato, is an idea that I don't think anyone in this room actually believes. No one in this room actually believes that all these ideas are equal. And what we need is the courage to stand by our convictions, that there is a fundamental difference between those in support of racial hierarchies and in war and extermination and those who are trying to create a better world. We don't need to defend somebody who's attacking the ACLU. That is not our burden. Our burden is simply to show that there are circumstances in which controversial speakers, defined as those who fundamentally undermine the norms of tolerance and those who fundamentally threaten the safety and well-being of others around them with these ideas, ought to be blocked. Because the purpose of the university is liberation. The purpose of us getting together and educating each other is to create a better world and help us live better lives. Not to uphold hierarchies, but to dismantle them. So the young people who are organizing at the front lines of anti-fascism, people who are out there putting their bodies literally under the wheels, people who are out there being attacked in their homes by white nationalists because they had the courage to stand up and say, no, I will not allow you to speak here. I don't think that they can be accused of trying to stay in their safe space. I think that we have examples on our side, coming from Richard Spencer himself, coming from Milo himself, that indicates that they are very afraid of no platforming. That's why they talk about it all the time. Indicating that the reason why their membership plummets is when they don't have access to large spaces to bring in recruits and do a big kind of rally that gets all the kids excited. This is just an anecdote, but when I ran Milo, in a group that I'm with, ran Milo out of the bar, he went bankrupt 3 days later. I can't claim all responsibility for that, but I think it certainly didn't help him. And they've given you no example, not one, of a single time in which a racist was turned around by a good debate. MLK didn't debate the racists. He organized against them. Because the truth is unsexy, and it's not going to win on its own. It needs our help, and it needs your help. And I hope that you will vote against the motion.
Thank you so much to our debaters. One more round of applause for these guys and their courage. Again, not experts in the subject, but it takes a lot of preparation and hard work to come up with arguments like this. And if you feel like this is something that you want to try as well, we have feedback forms where you can tell us what topics you want to talk about. We offer seminars. I'll get into that in a minute. But if you could all fill out your second ballot right now and hand it over to Thomas, we're going to calculate those up, and then we're going to determine a winner at the end. And one new feature that we have for this debate that I'm very excited for is a post-debate analysis by our esteemed professor, Dr. Stephen Yano. He's going to come up here and give us kind of a back and forth on what he thought worked really well, what needed improvement, and strategies for how to create argumentation. It's a little bit of a snippet of the seminars that we host every single month, so we hope you'll stick around for that, and then we'll give you the results right after that. So without further ado, Dr. Stephen Yana.
Thanks, Evan. Thank you guys for all coming out and sitting through a debate when you could be doing myriad other things. I think it speaks a lot to what you're interested in, and it's a good thing for somebody who's an old rhetoric professor to see. It makes me happy. And it's also interesting that people come out for debate, because I always wonder why people do, since debate in our country and in our society is generally considered to be a very negative, counterproductive thing. Mostly because debate exists in a colonized state. It's colonized on many different sides. It's colonized by the mass media, by media for profit. It's by a demand for scientific rationality in all discussions, no matter if they have anything to do with science or not. There's lots of opponents to a kind of thinking that wouldn't have any connections to all of this. So it's good to see you out here, so thank you guys for coming. I'm not going to spend too long while you fill your bells talking about the debate. I thought it was pretty good, but I think I should talk about the way I see debate and the way debate functions from a, I mean, you have some other professor up here that give you some other idea. But I think a lot of people approach debate and they see it as like hiring a professional housekeeper for controversy. They're going to come in and clean up all the dirt and all the junk, and they're going to declutter and organize your thoughts, and that's what a debate is meant to do. But I see debate as this thing, and I don't really know what it's called. You probably know what it's called, but I have the fortunate, I mean, as a university professor, I interact with young people all the time, which is great. And I befriend them on Facebook, and I see this thing that people do periodically where they run through colored dust. Does anybody know about this event? Holly, is that what it's called? Holly. Okay.
Yeah, the festival of colors.
Yeah, so everyone takes pictures and they're hit with all these bright colors. And I feel like that's the function, that's the metaphor I like for debate, is that you've come to a color run. So you probably have been stained by the number of colors that have been thrown at you from the people speaking up here. Debate explodes topics and disrupts cleanliness and disrupts order, and that's why it's valuable. It's not necessarily meant for, some people think of it as like a crucible burning away, trying to find the truth or anything like that. I don't think debate's a good tool for that. I think there's better tools for that if one wanted to seek the truth. But anyway, that's the approach that I take. So what did we see in this debate that I thought was interesting? Well, I'll give you three, actually two more, because the first one, I guess, the function of debate is to kind of get a bunch of colors on you, and then you can say, wow, look at all the things that I was exposed to, and then hit me. The second thing that I came up in this debate, or two big framing things that I think we should talk about in this debate. The first is, what is the function and nature of speech? I think that's something that we can come away with as one of the things that's kind of stained us. How does speech function? How should it function? What does it do? And there's lots of people over thousands of years who've written whole books on this, multiple volume books on this, that you can read. But in this debate, it might be a question that we could walk away with and think about how we've been colored with that idea. Does speech function as a necessary part of education? People against online learning would like to say yes. Do we have to have particular kinds of controversy? Is offensive speech a necessary part of education? That's a question I was left with. Does speech change minds? Or do we just like to think that a speech changed somebody's mind? Or does it act as a catalyst for a mind change from other types of interference, or other types of information? How does that function? That's one of the questions I'm left with. The second one is the function and nature of the university. You can go anywhere with this, but I think in a debate it's really nice to kind of have a very clear definition of what this is. And I really appreciated your comments on this, because I thought this was a nice way to debate. It's sort of like this really neat way to debate where you can just kind of make up whatever you think that institution is and then put it out there and speak as if you're speaking neutrally. So you'd be like, the FDA has a 7-part process before they clear a drug. And if it's reasonable, most people in the audience will accept it. They'll be like, oh yeah, that is reasonable. Because in debate, we're not after the truth or fact or anything like that. We're after reasonable arguments that help us get exposed to different kinds of ideas. So I thought this was kind of an interesting way to go. And at the end of the day, I'm left with thinking about the university's old role in loco parentis maybe returning. So in loco parentis was the idea in place of parents. This was like the 1940s, 1950s university, where the university saw itself as standing in for the parents of the kids whose charge they took, and they were supposed to make them good moral operators as well as educate them and all this kind of stuff. And it seems like there might be an argument at the end of this debate that we might be returning to that, except from the opposite direction. Like trying to make them good or appropriate thinkers, or think about the right things, rather than just thinkers or something like that. And what about the university as like a job training facility, which we hear a lot about? Or what about the university as a research organ or institution, which you hear a lot about? Can the university multitask? What's the function of like student services and student affairs and the academic side of the university? Because a lot of these people are brought in through student affairs. They're like as entertainment. They're brought in through budgets like that. So I thought about that too. It's kind of a question to think about. So there were 4 really good examples of excellent debate in this debate. One was how something ought to work is a good thing to think about in a debate. You can make a lot of arguments like that. So we heard from both sides how the university ought to work, how education ought to work. What should the university be like is a normative claim. And then how far away are we from that now, and what do we need to do to get closer to that, because that's our objective, that's our goal. We want the university to function properly. That's a really powerful commonplace to generate arguments from. The second one is how alternatives fail. So another interesting thing to do in a debate, to set yourself up, is to say, well, any kind of alternative to this, what we have now, it might not be the best thing, but any kind of alternative you could come up with would fail. JC talked about that a lot when he said any attempt to kind of stop this is really just going to get you a worse result than if you tried to stop it. And I think that's a powerful argument that gets a lot of assent, a lot of agreement from audiences a lot of times. It's a very powerful thing to use when you get into arguments as well. The third one is dangerous, huge impacts. This is Sam. And this is kind of a throwback for me. It's like the best of 2018 is the best of 2008. I used to judge Sam in intercollegiate debate competitions all the time. And I think this is a very powerful speech. It's dangerously huge impacts. So if you were to do this policy, it might work, it might be great, but then you're going to get these massively tectonic, incredibly destructive impacts that you don't want from that policy. I think it's a very powerful way to argue. It's also very strategic, because then you can talk a lot about things that you know a lot about and things that you think are incredibly powerful and persuasive based on one action. People really do like causal argumentation, even given that there's tons and tons of books about how dangerous and how poorly that works too, or how hard it is to make a causal argument. Talk to any scientist about that, any researching scientist about how easy is it proof that something causes something else. They'll be like, oh dear. I had a wonderful discussion with a physician about this, about how there's like 5 different ways you can argue whether a patient has had a heart attack, and there's not a lot of agreement among physicians. I don't know if there's any physicians here, but physicians have different understandings of that. So, I mean, that kind of rocked my world. I thought heart attack was pretty clear. But apparently, depending on your perspective and your point of view and what contextual evidence is there, you may have had a heart attack, you may have not. And the stakes are pretty high for that, especially for the patient. So, debates everywhere. And then the final thing is a nice litmus test kind of arguments where you would say, well, do we have a litmus test for this, which is, have we dipped a piece of test paper in another forum and seen what the result was? And then can we generalize via metaphor, via comparison from that? We saw that through the whole thing. So that's what I thought about it, is I think that, this is like a color run. I think those are some of the colors that hit me. I think that's the function of debate. I don't think we should allow debate to be colonized as, we're going to find the real answer here, the real truth. Debate's way too problematic for that. But I have a little bit of time left, I guess. Maybe if you have any questions about debate, I'll take maybe like 1 or 0.
No.
Or none. Okay, thank you.
Steve has been integral to this program. He and I created these seminars that we host every month where you can sign up. Every person gets to debate for about 3 minutes. We're using a new function where somebody can do a 7-minute on their own topics, but Steve will be guiding you through it. You'll deliver your argument, maybe get a couple of facets of debate beforehand to help you get started. We have debate guides, and then afterwards he'll critique and talk about what you could improve and what you did well. So very exciting stuff. Our next one is June 14th. I'm going to put down the screen here soon where there's like a $5 discount code that you guys can use if you want to go. Otherwise, our next debate is on June 20th in conjunction with the Rikers Debate Project, which teaches inmates debate over at Rikers Island Prison. We're actually going to have former students from the program debating here, and the motion is pretrial incarceration in the United States should be abolished. So that should be a really interesting debate. Without further ado, we'll move into results here. I want to thank Tom specifically for doing this for us. He's the owner and leader of the New York City Political Forum. If you guys want to follow them on Meetup, they're an amazing organization. There's a lot of people here today from there, so talk to them if you want to know more. Before the debate, we had 22 people for the motion, 4 people against the motion, and 10 people undecided. Afterwards, and this is really interesting actually, both sides netted positive votes. On the for side, they went from 22 votes to 26 votes, 4 plus net votes. On the no side, they went up from 4 votes to 6 votes, which means the highest net positive votes was for the for side. We are deemed our winners, Kyrie and Jaquan. Round of applause for them. So again, thank you all so much for being here. We hope you enjoyed this display of civil discourse. We hope you'll join us again. Again, it's not perfect, but we love it so much, and we want you guys to be a part of it. Come to me with any questions. Otherwise, we do need to get out of here by 8:45, just for the space sake. So mingle if you need to. Otherwise, we'll make another announcement around 8:45. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you, Sam. Thank you. You guys are great.
I recorded the whole thing.